A silent fleet rests in mud where bustling trade once defined an empire. This is the legacy of Silted Ports, a slow-moving environmental trap that has stranded ships and silenced markets throughout history. By the end of our journey, you will understand how to spot the invisible forces that can choke a civilization's lifeline. How could a harbor simply fill with mud? And what does a farmer's field have to do with a sailor's stranded ship? What forgotten story from a sunken wharf would you most want to hear? A captain watches his ship settle into the mud, the dock just out of reach. This is the slow, suffocating reality of a silted port. It is not a dramatic shipwreck, but a quiet, creeping crisis. The enemy is sediment, the fine particles of earth and sand that rivers carry from distant lands. Over years and decades, this sediment settles in the calm waters of a harbor, silently building a new floor, inch by relentless inch. The process is called siltation, a natural geological phenomenon that human activity can dramatically accelerate. When forests are cleared for farms or cities upstream, the bare soil has nothing to hold it. Rain washes it away, and rivers turn brown, carrying a heavier load of silt straight to the coast. River deltas are especially vulnerable, as they are nature's intended dumping ground for this material. The battle for a port's life is then decided by a few key forces. The first is the river's sediment load, how much dirt it brings to the door. The second is the power of tidal currents, which can either sweep the sediment out to sea or allow it to settle. The final factor is the port's own design. Can its layout and any defenses help keep the channels clear? For a thriving port city, this slow filling was an economic death by 1,000 cuts. It started with practical annoyances. Ships had to wait for high tide to enter, causing delays. Then came the rising cost of constant dredging, a financial drain that never ended. Finally, the moment arrived when the largest, most profitable ships could no longer enter at all. The trade routes shifted to deeper, clearer harbors, leaving a local fleet stranded in its own home, its markets falling silent. This environmental trap, set over decades, now sprung with devastating economic consequences. Ledgers from the 18th century tell a quiet story of fiscal panic. A city council pores over accounts, watching in dismay as the single-line item for harbor dredging swells to consume an ever larger portion of the budget. This was the first and most undeniable economic domino to fall. The relentless flow of sediment turned maintenance from a routine expense into a financial siege. Dredging, the mechanical process of scooping mud from the seafloor, was no longer an occasional chore. It became a permanent, costly war against the very land the city was built upon. We have records from ancient ports like Ephesus, where public funds originally meant for new temples or city walls were endlessly diverted to the grim, repetitive work of clearing channels. As the sediment kept coming, the dredging operations had to become more frequent and more extensive. Each passing year demanded more steam dredgers, more labor, and more gold from the treasury. This created a vicious, inescapable cycle. The more money a city spent just to keep its front door open, the less it had for everything else. There was nothing left for building better warehouses, for repairing quaysides, or for offering merchants favorable terms. Meanwhile, the port's efficiency crumbled. Ships arriving from distant lands would be forced to anchor far out, waiting for a dredge to clear a path or for a high tide that might grant them a few more feet of water. Cargoes had to be lightened, transferred to smaller, more numerous boats in a slow, expensive ballet of logistics. the cost per ton of spice, of cloth, of grain began to climb, making the port less and less competitive. This constant financial drain was the initial hairline crack in the city's economic foundation, a slow leak of prosperity that would soon lead to a much greater collapse. That merchant's frustration was more than just a personal setback. It was a symptom of a port's heart failure. The deep draft vessel, a ship designed to carry immense wealth across oceans, was now a prisoner of the shallows. Its deep keel, once a symbol of stability and capacity, became its greatest liability in a harbor slowly filling with silt. These ships were the undisputed workhorses of global trade. Their size and design made them incredibly efficient, capable of carrying spices from the Moluccas, silk from China, or grain from the Black Sea at a cost per item that made distant markets accessible. But that entire economic model was predicated on one simple physical reality. The ship had to be able to reach the dock. When siltation stole that reality, the entire system began to unravel. The process was brutally simple. A merchant captain, seeing the telltale brown water and knowing his charts were obsolete, would be forced to drop anchor miles from his destination. There, in the open roadstead, his precious cargo would undergo a dangerous and expensive transformation. Smaller boats called lighters would pull alongside. Teams of stevedores would then manually transfer the cargo from the large, stable ship to these smaller, bobbing craft. Every sack of grain, every crate of porcelain, every bolt of cloth had to be handled twice. This was not a simple delay. It was a multiplication of risk and cost. Each transfer increased the chance of damage, pilferage, or an entire lighter capsizing in a sudden squall. The time spent sitting at anchor meant paying crews for idle days while perishable goods like grain could spoil. The financial repercussions rippled outward instantly. Insurance premiums for cargoes bound for that port would skyrocket. Underwriters knew the risks were now far greater. The fees for hiring the lighter boats and their crews created a new, unwelcome line in a merchant's ledger. This transshipment tax, an unofficial but very real cost, made every commodity more expensive the moment it arrived. A port that was once a cheap and efficient hub became a costly bottleneck. Word traveled fast among trading houses. Why pay the extra tariff for the same spices when a rival port down the coast, blessed with a deep, clear channel, offered a straight shot to the wharf? One by one, the most lucrative trade routes would shift, following the path of least resistance and lowest cost. The local market, once bustling with the sounds of a dozen languages and the scent of exotic goods, would grow quiet. The complex, invisible web of contracts, loans, and partnerships that constituted long-distance trade simply recoiled from the obstacle, leaving the local fleet stranded not just in mud, but in economic isolation. The silence in the market was not just an absence of sound, but an absence of life itself. This market shift was the third and final economic domino, the one that sealed a city's fate. Consider the story of Bruges, a city that once pulsed as the commercial heart of Northern Europe. Its lifeblood was the Zwin, a tidal inlet that connected it to the North Sea. But as the Zwin gradually choked with silt, that connection narrowed, then faltered, and then failed. The consequence was both swift and absolute. The entire heart of European trade, a massive and fluid network of capital and goods, did not slowly decline. It picked up and moved. The rival port of Antwerp, with its deep, accessible Scheldt River, became the new nexus. For the merchants of the Hanseatic League and beyond, the decision was a simple calculation. Why fight the rising costs and constant delays of a dying port when a more reliable alternative was readily available? They rerouted their ships, their money, and their entire operations almost overnight in economic terms. The competitive advantage that Bruges had cultivated for centuries, its unparalleled accessibility, evaporated into the thick mud of its own harbor. The decline in port traffic was not a gentle slope but a cliff. Customs revenue, the tax money that fueled the city's treasury, dried up, but the true devastation was to the city's economic ecosystem. Think of all the invisible threads that depend on a busy port. The chandlers who sold rope and tar, the warehouses who guarded precious cargo, the innkeepers who housed sailors, the carters who moved goods through cobbled streets. One by one, these businesses withered. A master rope maker would watch his orders shrink from a dozen new hawsers a month to none. A tavern keeper would see his familiar patrons replaced by empty stools. The local market, once a roaring torrent of commerce, became a trickle and then a stagnant pond. This collapse was almost always irreversible. A trade route is a living thing, a habit of trust and logistics. Once it establishes a new home, it puts down roots, it builds new warehouses, forges new contracts, and creates new routines. It has no reason to look back. The city left behind becomes a historical relic, its grand guild halls and quaysides standing as beautiful, empty monuments to a prosperity that simply walked away, leaving behind silent markets and a stranded local fleet with nowhere to go. The axe falls in a distant forest, a decision made for a field or a fireplace, not for a port. Yet that single act of clearing land was a vote cast for the slow suffocation of a harbor hundreds of miles away. Upstream deforestation is the unseen catalyst that turns the slow process of siltation into an unstoppable flood. A healthy forest is a complex, living sponge. The canopy of leaves breaks the force of rainfall, while the vast, tangled web of roots acts like a net, holding the precious topsoil firmly in place. Water filters slowly into the ground, feeding streams at a steady, manageable rate. But when the trees are gone, this natural regulation system shatters. Rain hits the bare ground directly, with enough force to dislodge soil particles. With no roots to hold it back, the exposed earth is easily washed away, turning a gentle stream into a thick, brown torrent of liquid mud. This is the moment the farmer's field connects to the sailor's stranded ship. The soil lost from that hillside does not vanish. It enters the river system, becoming what hydrologists call the sediment load. The river, now overburdened, becomes a conveyor belt of destruction, carrying this immense volume of silt straight to the coast. In the calm, sheltered waters of a harbor, the river finally loses its energy. It can no longer carry its heavy burden, and the sediment settles out, particle by microscopic particle, silently building the harbor floor higher and higher. We see this tragic chain of events etched into the historical record. Studies of sediment cores from river deltas feeding the Mediterranean reveal layers of silt corresponding perfectly with known periods of intensive Roman land clearance. As legionaries and colonists cleared vast tracts of forest for villas and farms, they unknowingly signed a death warrant for the very ports that connected them to the rest of the empire. This is the cruel irony of the environmental trap. A local economic gain, a new field to feed a family, or a new settlement to secure a border, created a delayed and devastating cost for the maritime economy downstream. The farmer, simply trying to build a future, became an unwitting agent in the slow, silent grounding of an entire fleet. But the story of sediment is even more intricate, and the type of earth being washed away could determine just how quickly a harbor met its end. The texture of the mud itself could seal a harbor's fate. The particles washing downstream were not a uniform menace, but came in three distinct types, each with its own destructive personality. First, there is sand. Coarse and gritty, sand is the easiest of the three to fight. A dredge can bite into it and lift it out with relative efficiency. But sand is also fickle, moved easily by strong currents and tides. A channel cleared one week could be half filled again the next, forcing port authorities into a relentless, expensive game of whack-a-mole against the sea itself. Then there is silt, the fine, flour-like powder that gives the process its name. Silt is a stealthier adversary. Its tiny particles can stay suspended in water for days, creating a permanent, cloudy haze that blocks sunlight and smothers the marine life that once thrived in the clear harbor waters. When silt finally settles, it does not form a loose bed. It compacts into a dense, slippery muck that can suction a dredge's bucket, making removal a slow, frustrating ordeal. But the true nightmare for any port engineer was clay. When clay particles reached the saltwater of a harbor, a chemical reaction occurred, causing them to bind together into a hard, almost cement-like layer. This was not mere mud you could scoop away. It was a new, rock-hard floor being laid down over the original seabed, permanently reshaping the harbor's profile and making dredging nearly impossible. The very geology of a river's watershed, the types of rock and soil it drained, therefore wrote a hidden script for the ports at its mouth. A river carrying mostly sand from its mountains might allow a port to survive through constant, grueling effort. But a river delivering a load of fine silt and clay from vast plains was essentially delivering a death sentence, one that hardened with every passing season, explaining why some cities fought their losing battle for centuries while others were choked into silence within a few generations. The story of a silted port is not just a theory, it is written in the very landscape of ancient cities. We can walk through the ruins of Ephesus, one of the most magnificent cities of the classical world, and see this environmental trap laid bare. Ephesus was the jewel of Ionia, a city so wealthy and connected that its temple of Artemis was counted among the 7 wonders of the world. Its lifeblood was a deep, sheltered harbor on the Aegean Sea, a gateway for ships carrying treasures from across the Mediterranean. Yet today, if you stand where those mighty triremes once docked, you will not see water. You see flat, green fields. The sea is miles away, a distant shimmer beyond a wide plain of earth. The harbor is gone, buried under centuries of silt carried by the meandering Casta River. This was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, relentless invasion. For generations, the river delivered its burden of soil, a burden made heavier by the farmers clearing land for crops and the loggers felling trees for timber further upstream. Each rainstorm washed more of the hinterland down to the coast, and the harbor, a calm basin, was the perfect place for that soil to settle. The city fathers knew they were in a fight. They were Romans, masters of engineering, and they threw their ingenuity at the problem. They built canals to try and redirect the river's flow, to give its sediment a different path to the sea. But it was a battle against a force of nature that never tired, never ceased. The canals themselves would slowly fill, requiring endless maintenance that eventually became too costly, too futile. Inch by inch, year by year, the water retreated. The bustling harbor became a shallow lagoon, then a swampy, stagnant marsh. With the stagnant water came malaria, a deadly new resident that made the old port district a place of sickness rather than commerce. The economic foundation of the entire city simply dissolved. The deep draft ships could no longer reach the wharves. The merchants, the traders, the entire network of maritime commerce found a new home elsewhere. The markets, once echoing with the deals of a continent, fell silent. Ephesus was forced to abandon its very identity as a port city. Its population dwindled, eventually moving to a new location, leaving the glorious marble streets and grand theatre to be slowly buried by the same earth that had choked its harbor. The story of Ephesus is a profound lesson. It shows that even the greatest cities, with all their wealth and power, are not immune to the quiet, cumulative power of the land itself. A civilization's most vital connection to the world can be severed not by a conqueror's army, but by the steady, silent flow of mud. Far to the east, on the lush Malabar coast of India, another great port met its end, not with a slow, quiet sigh, but with a single, violent roar. This was Museris, a name that once conjured images of untold wealth for the merchants of Rome. Its docks were piled high with sacks of priceless black pepper and chests of glittering gems, a crucial link in a trade network that spanned half the world. Roman ships, braving the long journey across the Indian Ocean, would arrive here to exchange gold and wine for these exotic goods, filling the air with a cacophony of languages and the scent of spices. Then, around the year 1341, the landscape itself revolted. A catastrophic flood, likely a cyclone or a massive monsoon event, tore through the region. The Periyar River, the very waterway that gave Muziris life, exploded over its banks. It was not a gentle rise of water, but a torrent of immense power, carrying with it an entire continent of topsoil, sand, and debris. In a matter of days, perhaps even hours, the geography was rewritten. The flood scoured new channels and, most critically, dumped its immense sediment load directly into the sheltered estuary that served as the port's harbor. The deep, navigable channels that ocean-going ships relied on were simply filled in, buried under a sudden, shocking thickness of mud. The economic trap, which for other ports took generations to spring, snapped shut in an instant. One season, the largest Roman vessels could sail right up to the wharves. The next, they found their way blocked by newly formed sandbars and silt banks. The port was rendered unusable, not by a slow creep, but by a geographical coup de grace. The trade that had defined Museris for a millennium did not slowly drift away. It was severed. The merchant fleets, adaptable and ruthless in their pursuit of profit, simply rerouted. They shifted their operations to other, more accessible harbors along the same coast, like Cochin, leaving Museris utterly stranded. The market silence that followed was absolute and profound. The city was abandoned, its precise location fading from maps and memory, becoming a mere legend for centuries. It was only recently, through the work of archaeologists sifting through the very silt that destroyed it, that Museris has begun to whisper its story again. It stands as a stark reminder that the environmental forces that shape our world hold the power not only for slow erosion, but for sudden, irreversible collapse. The real tragedy of a silted port is measured not in tons of mud, but in shattered lives. Behind the silent cranes and empty warehouses were generations of people whose entire world was tied to the rhythm of the tides. Imagine the shipwright, a man whose father and grandfather taught him the art of shaping hulls from mighty oaks. For decades, his yard echoed with the sound of hammers and adzes. Then, one year, no new orders came. The local fleet was stranded, and no new ships were needed. His family's legacy, a craft perfected over centuries, became obsolete within a single generation. His tools grew quiet, and his skills, once his pride, were now worthless. Or picture the spice merchant, a woman who inherited a network of contacts stretching from her own wharf to distant continents. She once presided over a warehouse fragrant with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, a treasure house of scents and wealth. She watched season after season as the ships that replenished her stock grew smaller, then fewer, and then stopped coming altogether. Her shelves grew bare, her ledger books filled with red ink, and her life's work evaporated into the same air that once carried the promise of every arriving sail. These were not abstract economic statistics. They were personal catastrophes. For the sailors, their profound knowledge of local currents, hidden sandbars, and the perfect approach to the harbor became useless overnight. A lifetime of experience navigating these specific waters was rendered meaningless when the water itself was gone, replaced by unforgiving mud. They were left on the docks not by choice, but by a force they could not see and did not understand. The collapse rippled outwards through the entire city's economy. The rope maker, the sail sewer, the tavern keeper, the cart driver who moved goods from the quay, all of them saw their livelihoods disappear as the port's heart stopped beating. What do you do when the single industry that defines your city simply vanishes? The social fabric began to tear. Widespread poverty led to desperation and often to unrest. We find poignant evidence in the archives of dying ports, in desperate petitions to distant kings pleading for tax relief, in diaries that speak of empty bellies and a deeper emptiness of purpose. The most chilling records are the folk songs, the lamentations passed down through generations that speak of a golden age when the harbor was full and the future was bright. This human cost, this collective grief, is the final, sobering layer of the story. It reminds us that the long, slow process of siltation was not just a geological event or an economic trend. It was a human disaster, a relentless pressure that forced communities to make an impossible choice: stay and slowly starve in the place they called home, or abandon everything and migrate to a stranger's land in search of work. The environmental trap, in the end, was a trap for people. The relentless clanking of a steam dredger echoes the desperation of an entire civilization. Its massive, mechanical buckets dip into the murky water, each scoop a temporary victory in the eternal battle against the land itself. For as long as ports have faced the threat of siltation, human ingenuity has fought back with engineering. The first line of defense was often to outsmart the currents. Ancient engineers constructed massive stone walls called moles and breakwaters that reached out from the shore. These were not just for protection from waves. Their true genius lay in how they reshaped the flow of water. By narrowing a harbor's entrance or guiding the tidal flow in a specific path, they could accelerate the current, turning lazy water into a natural scrubbing brush that would scour the channel floor and carry sediment back out to sea. It was a brilliant attempt to use nature's own power against its destructive tendencies. Another strategy was to intercept the enemy before it reached the harbor gates. Diversion canals were dug to reroute the main flow of a sediment-laden river, bypassing the critical harbor basin entirely and dumping the silt load in a less destructive location. The Romans elevated this to an art form. At Caesarea Maritima, they built an entire artificial harbor using a revolutionary concrete that hardened underwater to create massive breakwaters. They designed these structures with a deep understanding of hydraulics, aiming to create currents that would keep their prized port clean. Yet for all their brilliance, these were ultimately defensive measures. They required constant upkeep and a deep, ongoing investment of labor and resources. The arrival of the industrial age brought new power to the fight. Steam-powered dredgers represented a shift from clever manipulation to raw, mechanical force. These behemoths could move volumes of mud that would have been unimaginable to Roman engineers. But this power came at a tremendous cost, both in fuel and in gold. The dredger did not solve the problem of siltation, it merely managed the symptom. The sediment kept coming from upstream, and the machine had to keep running year after year, its voracious appetite for coal and funding becoming a permanent drain on the city's treasury. This created a profound and tragic paradox. The The very technology deployed to save the port could accelerate its economic decline. The astronomical cost of maintaining the dredging fleet, of repairing the breakwaters, and of digging new diversion canals meant that a city was spending its prosperity just to maintain the status quo. There was no capital left for innovation, for attracting new business, or for improving the quality of life for its citizens. The port became a patient on life support, with the community bleeding money to keep its heart beating, a technological marvel that was also a financial trap. The battle was never truly won, only postponed at a price that often proved too high to pay. There is a moment when the fight is simply over. For a port city, this point of no return arrives not with a bang, but with a quiet, agonizing calculation. The city's leaders must finally ask themselves a terrible question. Is our future worth the price of our past? This tipping point is reached when the cost of adaptation, of endlessly battling the silt, definitively outweighs any conceivable future benefit. It is when the municipal budget reveals a horrifying truth. The line item for dredging and channel maintenance has grown so large it has cannibalized everything else. There is no money left for schools, for roads, for public health. The city is spending its entire inheritance just to keep a corpse on life support. The final blow can come from a single event. A catastrophic storm or flood, like the one that buried Museris, delivers a silting impact so severe that engineers simply shake their heads. The cost estimate to dig out is a number so astronomical it is functionally infinite. The port is not just damaged, it is geologically rewritten. But more often, the end comes from a simple, corporate decision made in a distant boardroom. A major shipping line, the last one keeping the route alive, sends a terse official notice. They are rerouting all their vessels permanently. That announcement is the death knell. It means the global market has officially passed its verdict. The port is no longer viable. At this stage, the environmental trap is fully and finally sprung. Investment evaporates overnight. Why would any merchant build a new warehouse when the ships will never return? The physical infrastructure of the port, the cranes and the warehouses and the custom houses, is left to the slow decay of rust and ivy. The city's identity, so deeply tied to the sea for centuries, begins a painful, fundamental shift. The collective memory of the community starts to reframe itself. It is no longer a city of sailors, but a city of what exactly? This decision to surrender to the silt is never easy. It is marked by political strife, with factions blaming each other for the decline. It is marked by community despair, a profound grief for a lost future. Studying these tipping points is a sobering lesson in the limits of human adaptation. We see that our economic and social systems, for all their complexity and resilience, ultimately operate within powerful, unforgiving constraints set by the physical world. A civilization can bend and innovate for a very long time, but when the land itself decides to reclaim its own, there is no contract, no technology, and no amount of hope that can reverse the verdict. Buried beneath a farmer's field in Italy, the skeleton of a Roman ship rests in dry dirt a full 8 miles from the sea. This is not a shipwreck in the traditional sense. It is a ship stranded, preserved in the very mud that killed its port. Modern archaeology gives these silent fleets a voice, using tools that feel like medical scanners for the Earth itself. Core sampling plunges a hollow tube deep into the ground, pulling up a layered history of sediment, pollen, and human debris. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of energy into the soil, painting a ghostly image of buried walls and sunken channels. Together, these techniques can map the precise outline of a harbor that vanished centuries ago, revealing its wharves and breakwaters now lying under meters of earth, far from the modern coastline. These are the ghost ports, and their ruins offer tangible, heartbreaking evidence of how the environmental trap closed. The nature of their burial tells a clear story. A port abandoned gradually will show layers upon layers of silt between artifacts, a slow and steady accumulation, but some sites reveal a more dramatic end. In Pisa, the discovery of multiple Roman merchant ships, all nestled together and perfectly preserved in thick clay, points to a single catastrophic event. A massive flood likely swept these vessels into a river bend where they were quickly buried in sediment, trapped in a geological snapshot of disaster. These ships were not deliberately scuttled. They were caught, their last voyage ended by the very landscape they depended on. These sites become unparalleled time capsules. An undisturbed warehouse, its clay jars still stacked and filled with grain that never reached its market, freezes a moment of bustling commerce. The personal belongings of a sailor, left behind on a ship swallowed by mud, speak to lives interrupted. We can reconstruct the final days of these ports with startling intimacy, understanding not just the grand engineering failure, but the taste of the last meal, the value of the last cargo, and the sudden silence that followed. The environmental trap, for all its slow and invisible work, left behind a stark and physical grave. Rain and drought could seal a harbor's fate as decisively as any engineer's miscalculation. Climate was the invisible hand that could tighten the environmental trap in a single season. Picture a period of intense, relentless rainfall sweeping across the river basin. The downpour does not gently soak into the earth. It slams into hillsides already stripped of their forest cover, tearing away vast quantities of soil in violent, muddy runoff. The river swells from a busy waterway into a raging, brown torrent, carrying a catastrophic pulse of sediment straight toward the coast. This is not the slow, steady accumulation of silt. It is a sediment bomb, a single event that can dump decades' worth of material into a harbor in a matter of days. The deep channel that took years to maintain is suddenly rendered useless, filled from bank to bank with a fresh, choking layer of mud. The port's dredging fleet, designed for a slow war of attrition, is utterly overwhelmed by this sudden geological ambush. Conversely, a prolonged drought could strangle a port just as effectively, but with a slow, thirsting pressure. When the rains fail, river levels drop dramatically. The water that remains becomes thick and syrupy with a high concentration of suspended silt, a dense soup that is impossible for even the most determined dredge to efficiently clear. More critically, the river's flow loses the energy needed to naturally scour the harbor entrance. Without that constant flushing action, every grain of sand and every particle of clay that enters the harbor simply stays there, settling into a permanent, suffocating blanket. The navigation channels, already marginal, become impassable for all but the smallest, most local boats. The global climate system held an even broader influence. A major shift, such as the onset of the Little Ice Age in Europe, brought cooler, wetter conditions that altered river flows across the continent. Heavier winter snows followed by spring melts meant more powerful, erosive runoff every single year. Rivers that had been stable for generations began carrying heavier sediment loads, pushing ports that were already on the edge past their breaking point. Similarly, a change in monsoon patterns could either starve a port of the freshwater needed to flush its channels or drown it in catastrophic floods, as the story of Museris so tragically illustrates. This reveals the profound vulnerability of these maritime centers. Their survival depended on a delicate balance, a precise equation of river flow, tidal energy, and sediment load. A shift in the regional climate could rewrite that equation overnight, turning a manageable problem into an existential crisis. The fate of a fleet and the city it served could be decided not by local decisions, but by atmospheric patterns unfolding thousands of miles away, a reminder that the threads connecting a civilization to its environment are both intricate and terrifyingly fragile. A ship stranded in one harbor meant a new course was being charted elsewhere. When the sea gates slammed shut, the relentless engine of commerce did not simply stop. It rerouted, flowing like water around an obstacle, seeking new paths of least resistance. The silting of a major seaport forced a dramatic, large-scale shift in the very geography of trade. Overland caravan routes along the arteries of continental exchange experienced a sudden revival. A journey by camel or ox cart was undeniably slower, more perilous, and far more expensive than a direct sea voyage. But it possessed one crucial advantage. It could completely bypass a blocked harbor, connecting inland producers directly to alternative markets or to different, still-functioning ports. Simultaneously, riverine trade on inland waterways surged in importance. Rivers became the new maritime highways, with fleets of shallow draft barges and riverboats connecting regions that had previously been served exclusively by the sea. A city located far up a navigable river might suddenly find itself at the heart of a new commercial network, its wharves bustling with activity that had been stolen from the silted coast. Consider the slow decline of the maritime silk road through the Persian Gulf. For centuries, goods from India and China flowed into ports like Suraf and Basra. But as these harbors battled the relentless silt from the Tigris, Euphrates, and other regional rivers, their competitive edge dulled. The cost and delay of navigating choked channels became too great. This environmental pressure created an opening, and trade began to shift. It moved south toward the Red Sea and the rising power of ports like Aden, and it also shifted back onto the land, revitalizing the overland caravan routes that snaked through Central Asia. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a fundamental replumbing of the global economy. The stranding of one fleet in the Persian Gulf meant the launching of another in the Red Sea. The wealth that once flowed into Basra now flowed into Cairo and Alexandria, redistributing political power and cultural influence across the medieval world. A new class of merchant princes rose inland in cities like Samarkand and Baghdad, whose fortunes were built on managing the caravan trade that now carried a greater share of the world's most precious goods. This constant reconfiguration reveals a profound truth about our interconnected world. An environmental trap in one location does not merely create a local disaster. It sends a shockwave through the entire system, forcing adaptation and creating unexpected winners and losers. The silent market in one city could be the direct cause of a roaring market 1,000 miles away. The soul of a port city is written in the scent of salt and tar and in the daily rhythm of the tide. When the ships stop coming, that soul is fractured. The silence is not merely an absence of commerce, but a severing from the world itself. For generations, the identity of everyone from the dockworker to the city councillor was woven from maritime life. Their calendars were set by sailing seasons, their gossip was news from foreign capitals, and their pride was the skyline of masts in the harbor. The sea was their partner, a living entity that provided and challenged in equal measure. But as the mud claimed the channels, that relationship curdled into one of bitter resentment. The same horizon that once promised riches now only represented a barrier, a vast blue wall separating them from their former lives. The sea was no longer a gateway, it was a taunt. This psychological rupture reshaped the entire culture. The grand stories of the city's founding, of the first great ship to arrive from the Orient, began to lose their power. They shifted from living history to legend, and then from legend to a kind of nostalgic fairy tale that grandparents told, their truth fading with each generation. A community that had always looked outward, its face turned to the winds, was forced to turn inward. Without the constant influx of new people, new ideas, and new goods, a cultural stagnation set in. The local dialect, once peppered with loanwords from a dozen languages, began to homogenize. Artistic styles, which had previously evolved through contact with foreign masters, became repetitive, fossilized echoes of a lost golden age. The city's very soul began to shrink, its world, confined to its own silted borders. We can see this profound loss etched into the folk art and literature that survived from these stranded communities. The vibrant paintings of bustling quaysides give way to somber, grey sketches of abandoned dry docks. The heroic sea shanties are replaced by mournful laments, songs that speak of empty cradles and still ropes. This was not just an economic depression, it was a collective grief for a future that had been stolen, a deep, generational melancholy that settled over the streets long after the last merchant had packed his ledger and left. The environmental trap, in its final act, did not just strand ships, it stranded an entire way of life, leaving a people adrift in the memory of what they once were. The ground itself can betray a civilization. Centuries before the slow mud of Ephesus, the Minoan world was shattered in a single, earth-shattering day. Their story offers a far more violent version of the environmental trap, one written not in silt but in fire and ash. On the island of Thera, a volcano that had been grumbling for decades finally tore itself apart. The eruption was one of the most powerful in human history, a cataclysm that would have been visible from the Minoan capital of Knossos on Crete, over 60 miles away. The initial blast would have been terrifying enough, but the true maritime disaster came next. When the volcano's cone collapsed into the sea, it triggered a tsunami of unimaginable scale. A wall of water hundreds of feet high raced across the Aegean. It did not simply flood the Minoan coastal settlements, it obliterated them. The very heart of their sea power, their magnificent fleet of trading ships and warships, was not stranded by mud, but was smashed to splinters against the very shores they called home. Their anchors, their docks, their skilled sailors all were consumed in a few violent minutes. The sea, their source of life and wealth, had become a weapon of absolute destruction. But the disaster was not over. The sky then began to fall. For days, the eruption spewed billions of tons of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, a thick, grey plume carried by the winds directly over Crete. This was a different kind of silt, a fine, abrasive powder that settled over everything. It blanketed their famous palaces, it choked their fertile fields, and it fell relentlessly upon their harbors. Imagine this ash falling onto the water, a constant, smothering rain. The heavier particles would have sunk, silting up the harbors and clogging the navigation channels that had not already been rearranged by the tsunami. The Minoan ports, the nexus of their trade empire, were hit with a 1-2 punch of physical destruction and slow, creeping burial. The ash did more than just fill the water. It poisoned the land. The thick layer covering the soil would have made it infertile, stunting crops and leading to widespread famine. A civilization cannot maintain a powerful navy or a vast trading network when its people are starving. The Minoans were a maritime empire, and their entire identity was built upon their connection to the sea. The Thuran eruption did not just damage that connection, it severed it completely and irrevocably. While their decline was likely a complex process, this single environmental catastrophe delivered a blow from which they could never fully recover. It underscores a brutal truth. The struggle between our maritime ambitions and the raw, unpredictable power of our planet is not a modern dilemma. It is a story as old as civilization itself, a reminder that whether by the slow creep of mud or the sudden fury of a volcano, the forces of the earth hold the ultimate power to silence our markets and strand our fleets. That same slow-moving environmental trap is tightening around some of the world's most vital trade hubs today. The ancient struggle between harbor and silt has not ended. It has simply scaled up, with 21st-century technology now waging a multi-billion-dollar war against a timeless geological force. Consider the port of Kolkata on the Hooghly River, a crucial gateway for India's economy. Here, a constant armada of dredgers works day and night, fighting to keep the channel open against an unrelenting tide of silt washed down from the Himalayas. The annual dredging bill runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars, a modern echo of the financial siege that crippled ancient cities like Ephesus. The causes, however, have been dramatically amplified. While deforestation remains a factor, the modern era has introduced a new and paradoxical disruptor, the dam. Massive hydroelectric and irrigation dams, like the ones lining the Yangtze River upstream from the megaport of Shanghai, are designed to control water. But they also act as immense sediment traps. The river, slowed by the reservoir, loses its energy and drops its load of silt behind the concrete wall. What flows downstream is often sediment-starved water, which can then erode the riverbanks further down, while the harbor itself is starved of the natural sediment that once helped maintain its delta. This human intervention in the natural sediment cycle creates a double bind. The port suffers from both altered currents and, in some cases, increased erosion, all while the reservoir slowly fills with the very material that should be nourishing the coast. The economic stakes of this battle are almost incomprehensibly high. A single day of closure at a port like Shanghai or Rotterdam can disrupt global supply chains, delay billions of dollars in goods, and send shockwaves through international markets. Our modern world is built on the assumption that these maritime arteries will remain open, yet that assumption is challenged every day by the steady, silent accumulation of mud. We now fight back with tools the Romans could never have conceived. Satellites monitor sediment plumes from space, providing a real-time picture of the problem. Engineers use complex computer models to predict siltation patterns and optimize multi-million-dollar dredging schedules. We build ever larger and more efficient dredges, mechanical behemoths that can swallow mountains of underwater earth. But this is still a defensive war, a costly management of a symptom. The core lesson from history remains stubbornly clear. If we ignore the long-term sediment dynamics of an entire river system, focusing only on the harbor itself, we are merely postponing a crisis. The crippling maintenance costs become a permanent tax on prosperity, and the port, no matter how technologically advanced, remains strategically vulnerable to changes in climate or land use far upstream. The ghost ports of the ancient world are not just ruins, they are a warning. They teach us that our most critical infrastructure exists in a delicate dance with the land, and that understanding that relationship is not a matter of historical curiosity, but of urgent contemporary survival. A port already fighting for breath could be killed by a single, violent tremor. The Earth does not operate in isolated compartments, and siltation was often just one instrument in a terrible environmental orchestra. Imagine a city that has spent generations battling the slow creep of mud, its engineers and treasuries stretched to their limits. Then an earthquake strikes. The ground heaves and the seabed itself is permanently rearranged. In some areas, the land rises, lifting ancient harbors completely out of the water and leaving them beached and useless. In others, the coast subsides, drowning waterfronts and allowing the sea to flood inland, where it deposits a new, thick layer of marine sediment over everything. This was not a theoretical risk. Historical records and geological studies along the coast of Turkey and Greece show clear evidence of ports being abruptly raised meters above sea level by seismic events. their connection to the maritime world severed in a single geologic instant. The earthquake did not just break walls, it broke the fundamental geography that made the city a port. For a community already strained by the financial drain of dredging, such a catastrophe was more than a setback. It was a verdict. There were no resources left to undertake the Herculean task of re-excavating an entirely new harbor basin or adapting to a radically altered coastline. The city's adaptive capacity, its ability to bounce back, was already depleted by its long war with silt. Then came the storms. A major hurricane or cyclone would lash the coast, its winds whipping up devastating storm surges. But the real, lasting damage often lay in the torrential rain it unleashed over the river basin. This rain would trigger catastrophic flooding upstream, scouring the landscape and sending a massive, concentrated pulse of mud and debris downstream, a silty tsunami that would arrive at the harbor just as the storm surge receded. The port, already shallow, would be buried under a fresh, thick layer of sediment, sometimes in a single day. This is the perfect storm of decline, where multiple environmental stressors converge and amplify each other. A city's defenses, designed for a slow, steady siege, are utterly overwhelmed by a simultaneous assault from land and sea. It is the difference between a leaky roof you can constantly patch and a hurricane that tears the entire structure away. One disaster you might survive. The combination of relentless siltation with a sudden, violent geological or climatic event was often a death sentence, proving that the greatest threat to a civilization was rarely a single point of failure, but a cascade of interconnected failures that pushed its system beyond the breaking point. A drowned city lives on in the song of its people long after its last stone is buried. Across the world, the silent trauma of silted ports and stranded fleets has been woven into the very fabric of local myth, transforming geological facts into tales of gods and magic. The Celtic legend of Wise tells of a magnificent city in Brittany, protected from the sea by a great dike and a single magical gate. The king's daughter, Dahut, is said to have stolen the key from her father and opened the gate during a storm, either out of reckless passion or as part of a devil's bargain. The ocean rushed in, swallowing the entire city and its bells, which fishermen claim they can still hear ringing from beneath the waves. This story of divine retribution for human sin is a powerful narrative wrapper for a probable truth: the slow or sudden submergence of a coastal settlement due to rising sea levels or a catastrophic storm surge that overwhelmed its defenses. Similarly, off the coast of modern Gujarat, the ancient city of Dwarka is central to Hindu mythology as the glorious kingdom of the god Krishna. Sacred texts describe its eventual submersion into the sea after Krishna's departure from the world. For centuries, this was considered pure allegory. Then, marine archaeologists discovered the remains of a large, sunken settlement in the exact location. Its structures dated to a period that aligns with the legendary narratives. The myth of Dwarka is not a fantasy, but a cultural memory of a real port city that was lost to the waves, its fate likely sealed by a combination of coastal erosion, siltation, and rising waters. These stories served a profound psychological purpose for the generations that came after the collapse. How do you explain the half-buried wharves in a farmer's field, or the stone foundations emerging from a coastal swamp at low tide? The people who found these ruins had no core samples or geological surveys. They had story. A legend of a drowned city provided a complete and emotionally resonant explanation for the inexplicable. It transformed a slow, impersonal environmental process into a dramatic narrative of moral failure and cosmic justice, or of magical beings and their curses. This act of myth-making ensured that the memory of the place was preserved, even if its true history was forgotten. The silent market was never truly silent because its story was still being told, a whispered warning from the past carried on the salt-laden wind. A political decision made in a distant capital could be as lethal as any flood. The relentless flow of silt created a vulnerability that rival states were quick to recognize and exploit. A port struggling to keep its channels open was a strategic weak point, an invitation for a competitor to apply pressure. An adversary might impose a naval blockade, not to stop ships from leaving, but to prevent them from even attempting the treacherous, silt-choked entrance. This physical stranglehold was often paired with a softer, more insidious campaign of economic diversion. Rival powers would actively court merchants, offering them favorable terms, safer anchorages, and political stability in their own well-maintained ports. They did not just open their doors, they actively lured trade away, turning an environmental problem into a geopolitical weapon. The silent market was not always an accident, sometimes it was a deliberate objective. From the perspective of a central empire, the calculus could shift dramatically. A port on the periphery of the realm, once crucial for projecting power, could become a financial black hole. As new territories were conquered or new alliances formed, the nation's strategic center of gravity moved. The treasury might ask, why pour endless gold into dredging the harbor of a city that no longer serves a vital imperial purpose? That distant port's decline from a strategic asset to a fiscal liability was a death sentence signed by a faraway minister who had never even smelled its salt air. The glorious Venetian Republic learned this harsh lesson. For centuries, its wealth and power were built upon the intricate ports and lagoons of the Adriatic. But its lifeblood was the Mediterranean trade, a network that was itself being slowly strangled. Not only was silt a constant battle in their own lagoon, but a world-changing geopolitical shift was unfolding. The rise of Atlantic powers like Portugal and Spain, and the discovery of new sea routes to the Indies around the Cape of Good Hope fundamentally rewrote the map of global commerce. The Mediterranean Sea, once the undisputed center of the world, was suddenly relegated to a secondary role, a backwater. The Venetian ports, no matter how diligently they were dredged, were now on the wrong side of history. Their geopolitical centrality evaporated, and with it the political will to fund their perpetual defense against the mud. The environmental trap of siltation was bad enough, but when combined with a seismic shift in global politics, it became inescapable. This reveals the final, sobering layer of the story. A port could battle the river, it could battle the sea, but it could not always battle the cold, calculated decisions of kings and merchants who had simply decided it was no longer worth the fight. A long, muddy cylinder pulled from the earth holds chapters of a story no scribe ever wrote. This is a sediment core, an archive of a port's life and death written in layers of silt and sand. Scientists extract these cores from the very basins where ancient ships once docked, and within their stratified depths, they find a timeline more precise than many crumbling parchments. Each distinct band of material, from coarse sand to fine clay, marks a different era, a year of floods or droughts, of prosperity or neglect. The core is a physical calendar, its pages made of earth. To read it, researchers look beyond the mud itself to the tiny time capsules trapped within. They sift through the layers for pollen grains, microscopic and incredibly durable. A sudden decline in tree pollen and a corresponding spike in grains from cultivated grasses or olive trees tells a clear story. It marks the moment when forests were cleared for farms upstream, a decision that would, years later, send a choking load of topsoil straight into the harbor's heart. This is the direct, physical evidence linking a farmer's plow to a sailor's stranded ship. Other clues lie in the microfossils, the minute shells of creatures that lived in the water. A shift from salt-tolerant species to those that thrive in brackish, fresher water indicates the harbor was becoming more isolated from the sea, perhaps as a sandbar sealed its entrance. A layer devoid of any life at all might point to a catastrophic event that smothered the entire ecosystem under a sudden deluge of mud. The core can even record human industry. A distinct band enriched with lead often corresponds to a period of intense mining or smelting, the pollution washed from the land and preserved in the harbor mud like a dirty fingerprint. Most dramatic are the sudden, chaotic layers. A thick band of coarse sand sandwiched between fine silts is the unmistakable signature of a powerful storm or a catastrophic flood, a single, violent event that dumped years of sediment in one go. By counting these layers and using techniques like radiocarbon dating, scientists can assign precise years to these events, building a high-resolution timeline of the port's decline. This objective physical record often confirms the desperate pleas for aid found in historical documents, but it can also challenge the official story, revealing an environmental crisis that began long before the city's leaders were willing to admit it. The silent harbor, it turns out, has been whispering its truth all along, waiting for someone to listen. This concept of a slow-moving, inescapable decline is what scholars now term an environmental trap. It is a pattern where a society's greatest strengths, the very foundations of its success, become the instruments of its eventual downfall. A port city, for instance, would flourish because of its perfect natural harbor. That initial geographic gift encouraged population growth, which demanded more farmland. So forests were cleared upstream, a rational decision to feed a thriving city. The port's success funded magnificent buildings and a powerful navy, creating a vibrant culture entirely dependent on the sea. Yet each of these achievements, each new field and each new citizen, sent more soil washing down the river. The city was literally building the mud that would one day choke it. The trap is not merely an external disaster, it is an internal bind. The entire social, economic, and political identity of the city becomes so deeply invested in the port that imagining any other future is impossible. The tax base, the jobs, the culture, the very soul of the place are all tied to those docks. So when the silt begins to win, the only conceivable response is to fight harder, to spend more on dredgers, to dig deeper into the treasury. The system is too rigid to pivot. There is no plan B. This is the core of the trap. The short-term solutions, like massive dredging projects, address the symptom but ignore the root cause, which lies far upstream in the land management practices of the entire region. The city is locked in, forced to pour its remaining wealth into a battle it cannot ultimately win, because winning would require dismantling the very system that defines it. Recognizing this pattern in the silent ports of the past gives us a powerful lens for examining our own world. Where are we today, investing in systems that are inherently ephemeral? Where are our own short-term gains, our most celebrated engineering marvels, quietly creating long-term vulnerabilities that we may one day find too costly to escape? The story of the stranded fleet is not just a history lesson. It is a cautionary tale about the hidden geometry of progress and the silent traps that can form in the space between human ambition and the enduring power of the land. Yet the historical record is not a uniform chronicle of defeat. Against the tragic tales of Ephesus and Muziris, we find the remarkable stories of ports that refused to be strangled, that fought the mud and won. London and Rotterdam stand as titans of this relentless struggle, their very existence a testament to a different kind of human response. While the environmental challenge of siltation was a universal force, their resilience proves that the ultimate outcome was a matter of choice, will, and immense investment. So what set these survivors apart? Their success was never due to a single magic bullet, but a powerful combination of factors that created an unstoppable momentum. First, and perhaps most crucially, was the sheer economic and political will to fund a perpetual war. These cities possessed economies so vast and governments so committed to their maritime role that the astronomical cost of continuous dredging and engineering was simply accepted as the price of doing business. It was not a temporary expense, but a permanent, non-negotiable line in the city's budget, funded by the immense wealth the port itself generated. Second, they had a crucial geographical advantage that dying ports lacked: the physical space to adapt. When the original heart of the Port of London began to silt, the city did not just give up. It moved downstream, building vast new complexes of deeper docks, like the Royal Docks, further east where the Thames was wider and deeper. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a wholesale migration of the entire port infrastructure, a feat only possible with vast capital and space to expand. Rotterdam executed a similar strategy on an even grander scale, relentlessly pushing its harbour mouth toward the North Sea with its monumental Europort and Maasvlakte extensions, always staying one step ahead of the sediment. Finally, these resilient ports benefited from a diverse economic base. They were not solely dependent on the arrival of a single commodity like pepper or silk. Their economies were complex ecosystems of finance, insurance, manufacturing, and trade in 1,000 different goods. This diversification meant that a temporary slowdown in port traffic was a serious problem, but not an automatic death sentence. The city had other engines to keep it running while it solved its maritime crisis. These success stories reveal a profound truth. The ports that survived viewed the problem of siltation not as a final verdict, but as a manageable, if eternal, operational challenge. They invested not just in steam shovels, but in the knowledge and flexible infrastructure needed to stay ahead of the curve. They turned a potential environmental trap into a difficult but solvable equation of engineering and economics. In their enduring success, we find a crucial counterpoint to the silent markets of the past, a powerful reminder that a dire environmental prognosis can be defied with relentless innovation and the sustained will to never, ever surrender. The wisdom of those silent fleets now echoes in the blueprints of modern harbors. Future-proofing our maritime gateways demands a fundamental shift in perspective, moving from fighting symptoms to healing entire systems. It requires us to see a port not as an isolated dock, but as the final piece in a vast, interconnected puzzle that stretches from mountain forests to the ocean floor. The key lesson is integration. We must connect land-use decisions made hundreds of miles upstream with the management of the coastline downstream. A farmer's choice of crop, a forester's plan for timber, a city's stormwater system, all these factors contribute to the sediment load that will one day arrive at the harbor's mouth. By planning across this entire watershed, we can address the problem at its source, reducing the amount of silt that ever begins the journey toward our critical shipping lanes. This systemic view also champions the protection of natural defenses. Coastal wetlands and salt marshes are not wasted space. They are immense, living sponges for sediment. When a river laden with silt meets a healthy marsh, the vegetation slows the water's flow, allowing the suspended particles to settle out harmlessly across a wide area instead of being dumped directly into a dredged channel. Preserving and restoring these ecosystems is not just an environmental gesture. It is a cost-effective form of harbor maintenance performed by nature itself. Port design itself is being reimagined with adaptability in mind. Instead of static, rigid structures, engineers now plan for change. They consider how sea level rise will alter currents and sediment patterns, and how more intense storms might deliver catastrophic pulses of mud. This means designing quays that can be raised, creating flexible containment areas for dredged material, and even planning for the possibility of managed, strategic retreat from the most vulnerable areas. Perhaps the most profound lesson is the need for economic resilience. A city that puts all its wealth and identity into its port is building on a single, fragile pillar. The most secure harbors of the future will belong to cities that have cultivated diverse economies in technology, education, manufacturing, and services. This diversification creates a safety net. If a storm silts the channel or a global trade route shifts, the city has other engines to sustain it while the port recovers. It prevents the kind of total, irreversible collapse that stranded the fleets of the past. The ghosts of Ephesus and Muziris offer a clear choice. We can continue the ancient, costly war of attrition against the land, or we can finally learn to work with its rhythms. The goal is no longer to build the most efficient port, but to cultivate the most resilient one, ensuring that the vital connections of our global community are never again severed by the slow, predictable flow.